Today's ALCTS webinar on preserving your digital memories. I'm Stephanie Lampson. On behalf of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, I am delighted to introduce this free webinar as part of ALA's Preservation Week. Our presenter today is Bill LeFurgy, Digital Initiatives Manager at the Library of Congress's National Digital Information Infrastructure and Preservation Program, also known as INDIP. Bill leads the INDIP Communications Team, a group that interacts with a broad range of people interested in preserving access to digital information. In previous positions, Bill dealt with electronic records at the National Archives and Records Administration and served as Baltimore City Archivist and Records Management Officer. While he has memories of punch cards, monochrome monitors, and 30-pound portable computers, he is also an enthusiastic creator and consumer of social media. He has a BA in History from McGill University, as well as an MLS and MA in History from the University of Maryland. Before we begin, a few quick notes on today's webinar. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into the question box on your screen, and Bill will do his best to answer as many questions as possible at the conclusion of his presentation. We do have a large number of attendees today, so please understand if we don't get to your question during the webinar. Also, please note that today's presentation will be recorded, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording shortly after the conclusion of the webinar. The presentation will also be archived and freely available at the ALCTS webinar website. So with that, I will turn the program over to Bill.
Hello, and welcome to the webinar. I'm going to talk about some tips for preserving your personal digital memories. But first, I'd like to thank the Association for Library Collections and Technical Services for hosting the webinar as part of Preservation Week. This is really a great opportunity to highlight the issues of personal digital archiving and to talk about some basic steps that individuals and families can take to pass it on, which of course is the tagline for Preservation Week. We're talking here today about information that's already in digital form. Much of this is what we call born digital, which means it's created in digital form and typically has no hard copy version. Examples are digital photos, email, and content on the web. Also included are scanned or digitized copies of hard copy originals. During my talk, I'm going to refer to digital materials generally as files or documents. It's just a general way of describing all digital content. Now, this presentation is really geared to a general audience. What we're aiming to do is to provide a starting point for personal digital archiving. Let me say also that the process of scanning hard copy originals is beyond the scope of the presentation, and I will not be talking about it. Now, here's a pretty typical way that lots of people have kept their memories over the years. These are items, photographs, letters that are casually packed into a shoebox. It's a method that actually works pretty well. You can keep a shoebox on a shelf for a long time with no special care. You can take it down in 10 years, and you can probably still read the letters and look at the pictures without any kind of problem. You can also easily pass the shoebox on to your children or other family members for them to use into the future. That's because hard copy personal memories are made of relatively reliable, long-lasting materials. They can take a fair amount of abuse without losing their informational or emotional value. Now, for example, on this slide, you can see a photo that's been torn and crudely mended with some old Scotch tape. But despite that, and it looks like it's fairly old, you can still recognize the people in it and understand what the scene's about. And another reason that letters and photographic prints are good for the long term is that you can read them and use them and view them without using any kind of special equipment. But as we all know, things like letters and photographs and prints are being overtaken by digital technology. And for many, the record of their lives is pretty much digital these days. This slide shows my memories from a trip that I took to India in 2009. This is all that I have in the way of memories from that trip, and they are 100% digital. Now this tendency for the digital to kind of take over the way that we record our memories really has big consequences, and I'd like to talk about them a little bit. To start with, we're all, or many of us, are creating increasingly large amounts of personal digital information. We're taking more digital pictures, more digital videos, we're putting content on the web. We're generating more and more personal digital memories. And it's pretty clear that this is a trend that's just going to keep on going. Kids today are themselves born digital, as we say, and they start using and creating digital content at a pretty young age. Now think about the implications of this. A typical family today can easily build a pretty big collection of digital memories, and they're likely going to want to hang on to them. The kids themselves are active in building up these digital memories, and they're going to be at least as eager to be able to use and access those memories over the years as the contents of that old shoebox. But digital files face many risks to their long-term survival. So the question is, will today's digital files last into the future? And what we have for you now is a poll in which we are going to ask you some questions, and you'll have a chance to answer. So you should see on your screen the question, which is, what are some of the principal risks to the preservation of digital files? And the possible answers are obsolete equipment and storage media. B is large volume of files scattered among many different devices and services. C, user mistakes, forgetfulness, and procrastination. And D, acidic paper. So you have the opportunity to answer these questions and think about it. And then what we can do is, after we've given you a little time to do this, we can move on. And this is also a chance for you to start thinking about your own situation and perhaps how you're keeping personal digital information, or how you might. So we're getting a pretty good response here. So let me kind of tell you what the answers are. The answers really are A, B, and C. And these are really some of the biggest risks that are out there to personal digital memories. Acidic paper, that's more of a problem for books, paper, letters, or more traditional kinds of personal memories. But we've shared just a couple or several of the risks that are out there. Let's think about some other ones. So, as you have seen from that first question, it can be hard to preserve digital memories. Let's kind of go over what some of the risks are. One of the big ones is that the storage media that you use to record your digital information can go obsolete. We have here on the screen pictures of some of the old floppy disks. Those of you of a certain age can remember maybe using those. Those of you below a certain age probably think these look like antique relics. And they would be if you had information on one of these disks today, it would be very hard to be able to pull it off. It's simply because there aren't machines around that allow you to do that. Some of the other, another problem is that computers are pretty fragile. If you drop your laptop, you face a risk of losing all the information that's on it. Fires and floods and other natural disasters are a big threat to all kinds of information, but digital information is particularly vulnerable because even slight damage to a computer or to storage material can have devastating consequences. Another big problem is scattering. And by scattering, I mean we all have desktop home computers, we have laptops, many of us have laptops, we have smartphones, perhaps we have a digital camera, we use different social media sites. So in effect, what we have is our digital memories spread all over the place. And having them spread all over the place makes it very difficult to keep track of them and to manage them. And last but not least, people being people, they tend to make mistakes from time to time. And if you make a mistake with a digital file, you can find that the technology is pretty unforgiving. Now, personally, I find that I'm a little slow from time to time to back up my personal files. And I'm really taking a risk by not doing that. Because if something happens, what I'm going to find is I may lose some of my more recent files, and I'll end up regretting being so forgetful. Now, hard copy documents can degrade gracefully. They can endure some tearing and rough handling, like we saw with that picture that had the Scotch tape on it, the old Scotch tape on it. But digital files, in contrast, can become corrupted or lost in the blink of an eye. And by lost, what I mean is that this lovely picture you see here can turn into something like this, which is basically a computer telling you that it can't read the file, there's some sort of problem with it, and what that boils down to is that lost in the digital world means really lost, as in nearly impossible to get back. Now think about it. Have you ever accidentally deleted an important file or had the hard disk on your computer fail? Every type of digital memory that you have, that you've ever created, is really facing that same sort of risk right now if you haven't taken steps to back it up. Okay, I may have scared you, but there is some good news here. There really are some actions and some steps that you can take to be able to help your digital memories last into the future. And the basic idea really is that we're encouraging what we call active management of your digital memories. And what that means is moving beyond the shoebox approach to address some of the specific vulnerabilities of digital files. Now, the key here is vigilance, both now and continuing into the future. So here's the sequence of recommended steps that we have for actively managing your digital memories. There are 4 of them. And we tried to make them relatively straightforward. First of all, we want you to identify where your files are, then decide which of those files are most important. The third step, third tip is to organize the files, and then last but not least is to make copies of the files that you've identified and organized and store the copies in different places. Now I'll go over each one of these tips individually, and we'll talk about some good practices for putting them into action. But first, let me say something about the intent behind these tips. We try to make the tips general enough to apply to different kinds of digital files. Now, this means that we avoid extensive technical details about working with different kinds of digital formats. We wanted our guidance to be able to apply equally well to photographs as they do to video, as they do to email, or to content on the web. And we also wanted to make sure that we can provide some practical advice that everyone can adopt and start to use to make their digital files last. One of the key considerations that we had is that we wanted this advice to be available and accessible to people who aren't technical experts. Computer technology can be intimidating and frustrating, and sometimes so much so that it gets in the way of average people even wanting to get started working on personal digital archiving. The idea of trying to wrangle with difficult machines and complicated technology can really put people off. So what we've done here is try to keep things as simple as possible. And what these tips are basically a starting point. And there are some more technical details that we have on our website, which I will mention at the end of the presentation, for anybody who wants to go a little deeper and try to get into some of the more finer technical details. Another consideration is that we wanted to be able to provide some advice that people can either spend a lot of time following or maybe even just a little bit of time following. Another barrier to personal digital archiving is maybe some concern that people have, oh, I'm busy enough already. I don't really have time to spend weeks on end going through and doing all this work with my digital content. So what we try to do is be flexible enough so that these tips can yield some positive results, even if you only go in and spend a little bit of time working on them. On the other hand, the more time you spend, the better results you'll be. But you've got the option about how much time you can spend doing it. So here's the first tip, and I'll spend a little time talking about this. This is trying to figure out where all your personal digital files are located. Now, as I mentioned, many people have their files in different places, on different devices, different places on the internet or the web. It's a good starting point to be able to know what files you have and where they are, and be able to put yourself in a great position to make some good decisions about how you're going to manage them. The best place to really get started in terms of identifying your files is to start thinking about the one device or the one location with the files that you immediately think of as significant. It might be a digital camera that has some family pictures, or it could be your laptop that you use every day. The thing of it is, you don't necessarily want to be 100% comprehensive. You just want to find a place to get started. Now, what you see on the screen here is my own personal phone with some of my favorite family pictures. If I were just getting into saving my personal digital files, this is where I personally would begin. Second tip is deciding which of the files are the most important. Now, it's possible, it's perhaps even likely, that we can have hundreds of digital files on a single device, or perhaps even thousands of digital files in total. It's fair to say that not all these files have the same emotional or informational value. So what you want to do is select the ones out of those perhaps many thousands that are most important. And by doing so, what you can do is reduce the volume, the number of files that you need to manage for the long term. Future users will also thank you for selecting the most meaningful items rather than making them look through lots of clutter. But again, flexibility is the key here. What you select and how you do it is up to you. If you just want to pick a few files, that's okay. For example, I showed you my phone with some family pictures on it. If that's where you want to get started and focus on, that's fine. You can always go back and pick some more later. The middle way is to go through your files and to really save the batches that are best. So that means in strawberry terms that you go through, and the ones that are bruised and less desirable, you can leave them behind, but you put the good ones in a few baskets. On the other hand, some people are reluctant to throw anything away. They want to keep everything, and that's okay too. What you can do is lump lots of files into your personal digital collection for preservation. And that gives you or somebody else the option of making more detailed selections into the future. But at least what you'll have is all that material persisting and available for someone to use into the future. Now, a good practice in this area is to really weed out some of the redundant information that exists in personal digital files. Multiple copies of the same item or nearly the same item typically offer little information but can clutter up your collection. Now, look at this, these pictures of these trees, of this forest scene. How many pictures of this do you really need? Do you need all three? Maybe you could do with one, or perhaps maybe you don't need any of them. But what you want to be able to do is to make a choice and to be able to select the ones that are most valuable in terms that you define. Now, I have to say that when you're doing this, there are some technical considerations. You'll want to be able to keep the most detailed and complete version of a file, and factors such as image resolution and file format come into play there. And we provide more detail about these issues on our website. This brings us to tip 3, which is to organize what you select. What you really want to be able to do is impart a meaningful organization to your personal digital collection. The idea is to group your files into some kind of logical order to help others understand what the collection is about, and to help them find individual items. Now, as with previous steps, the benefits grow with the amount of effort that you put into this. The basic strategy for organization of digital content is to create a hierarchical system of digital folders, or also known as directories, on your computer. And I have an example on the screen here. The top level has something called Digital Archive, which is everything in the collection. And there are also subcategories, subfolders for documents, emails, photos, videos. And just as an example, you can see under photographs, there's a subcategory that could be arranged by something like subject, topic, date, or some other method. What you do is that after you've created this folder system, this directory system, is that you can put the items that you selected in the previous step into the proper place, into the proper folder or subfolder to keep them organized. Another good practice in the organization area is to describe your individual files. You can do this before or after they're put into the folder system. This is a really important step because what it does is it helps you, and probably more importantly, it helps people after you better understand the information the photo or whatever the item is contains and what it's about. And it also makes the item easier to find. The best thing to do is to make sure that each one of the files, your individual items, has some sort of a descriptive name and a date associated with it. If there are any other file details that you can provide, such as place, where it's taking place, names of people who are involved, what the activity is, that's very, very useful. Now, what you can see here is an example from Flickr, a really good example of someone who has gone through and really put in some good information about what's happening in each one of these pictures, which makes this information, the photos, that much more useful and accessible. Now, it's assigning what we call metadata to this, to individual items, can be very time-consuming, as anybody who has done that knows. But if you can do it, the payoff is really wonderful for you and for people after you. Another good practice is to have a hard copy file inventory. After you've developed your folder system for your collection, it's a good idea to print out or write down a copy of what the categories in that system. Now, this is a good idea for a couple of reasons. First, it's a quick way to remember what it is that you have and how it's organized. And second, it will be really useful for people in the future who are interested in the collection. And what you want to do is make sure that you have a hard copy of the inventory kept with your important papers so that people after you who are interested in the collection know what's in it and where it is. This brings us to tip 4, which last but certainly not least. In fact, this may be the most important one of all. What we advise is that you create at least one duplicate copy of your personal digital memories collection and store it separately from the original. You might have your original digital archive folder system on your laptop or home computer. You would then make a complete copy of the file and send the copy for safekeeping as far away from the original as you can. Say, for example, you lived in Seattle. You could send a CD-ROM copy of your collection to your aunt or somebody who lives in Washington, D.C. If there were some sort of a disaster that harmed your home computer in Seattle, the odds are that the CD copy across the country would be safe. Now, we say that you should have at least one copy, but it's even better to have multiple copies. Each extra copy increases the odds that your files will be usable into the future. But what kind of storage should you use? And what we're going to do here is go to our second poll and give you a chance to think about some individual types of storage material. So the question is, which of the following is the ideal way to store your personal digital collection? A, you can use a CD-ROM or a DVD-ROM. These would be burnable CDs or DVDs. You could use an external hard drive. You could use a flash drive that plugs into your computer or your laptop. Or you could use cloud storage on the internet. There are a number of services that have popped up in that area, and basically what they allow is to be able to store your files remotely on some server someplace else. Or E, none of the above. So you've got some choices here, and the idea is that you'll want to select one or more of these and be able to use them to keep your personal information alive and safe. So let's go to the answer, which is E, none of the above. Now, all of these storage devices are wonderful technologies, amazing technologies in many cases, but each of them also has its shortcomings, and you shouldn't rely on any one of them alone. And let's talk a little bit about why that is. We see on the screen here are some examples of different types of storage materials, but none of these really rates as a silver bullet in terms of long-term preservation and access. And that's because few storage devices can be trusted to work properly for more than 5 years. They all have a risk of losing or corrupting data over time. Now, cloud storage is a viable option. It's a useful option. But the fact of the matter is, any kind of commercial company can't promise that it's going to be around much into the future, or that it's going to keep providing the same kind of service into the future. So it's not the type of service that you could use to keep your files, or that you should feel comfortable necessarily using to keep your files in perpetuity. So there's some uncertainty here with any kind of device that you can use, that you can currently use to be able to store your materials. So for that reason, we recommend that you use different methods to store your copies. One copy could be put on an external hard drive, perhaps, while you could keep another copy off in the cloud somewhere. So in 5 or 10 or however many years into the future, one of those copies might be gone, might have stopped working or gone away. But the other copy, which is using a different type of technology or a different method, hopefully will still be there and still be useful. Remember the idea that I mentioned earlier about creating a hard copy file inventory? You should also keep a copy of that inventory with each copy of your digital collection. That is to say, if you have an external hard drive, you should keep a printout or some sort of hard copy of that inventory with the hard drive. That's because at some point in the future, say a family member discovers this, by then will look like an antique, they're going to be able to see the inventory and understand what's on the hard drive and what significance it has. Now, a good practice in the whole making copies and storing them separately area is that you're going to want to really explore actively managing this content. In fact, you're going to want to make sure that you actively manage it, your content. You've already done lots of hard work identifying and selecting and describing and storing your collection. But remember that we're still dealing with very fragile media. We're dealing with very fragile files. So, unfortunately, your work isn't done. What we recommend is that every year you go in and you check a few of your files on each one of your copy sets to make sure that they're still accessible. If you check your CD-ROM, your copy CD-ROM, or your hard drive, and you discover you can't read it, then it's time to get rid of that copy and make another one. And to be on the safe side, we currently recommend making new copies of all your content on new storage media every 5 years. That's, again, just to make sure that the media that you're using doesn't give out on you at some point. Another part of active management is periodically adding new items to your personal digital collection. As new things come along and as they're recorded in your family life or your personal life, you're going to want to make sure that you update your existing collection with copies of that new information. And you'll also want to be able to keep the file inventory current. So if you add new categories, you want to make sure that your file inventory reflects that. Okay, so here's a summary of what I've been talking about. As I've mentioned, a personal digital collection, it's really best thought of as a dynamic and actively managed thing. And our 4 tips attempt to reflect this. They also aim to be a flexible starting point for people to take charge of saving their digital memories. As you follow this guidance, you'll probably have more questions about how to deal with some particular kinds of digital materials. And we have some additional resources that can help you. You can find lots more information on our website, which includes videos, podcasts, and other educational resources, and that's www.digitalpreservation.gov. The personal archiving selection or section is /U, and there is a there's a link to that off the main page. I've also provided a link here to our digital preservation video series, in which we talk about different issues relating to digital preservation and also personal archiving. We're on Facebook, and I encourage all of you to like us on Facebook. We're very interested in talking and engaging with people on Facebook about personal digital archiving, and we're adding more resources all the time to our Facebook page. We're also on Twitter, fairly recently on Twitter, and our tweets often focus on personal digital archiving. So follow us at NDIP. You can contact us also with any questions that you have, and we'll do our best to answer them. That's it for the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to address some questions now. Okay, lots of questions here. This is great. The first question is, will there be a recording available so that they can review the webinar in the future? I am told yes. The good folks at ALCTS will provide a copy of the webinar on the website very soon after after we're finished here. Let's see. My question, is there a standard documented to preserve personal digital memories? If by standard you mean some sort of formally approved and generally accepted method, the answer is no. There are a number of individual standards that can be helpful for doing personal digital archiving, but there isn't one overall standard that can be used. This is still a fairly new topic, and we're still sort of trying to figure out what the best practices are. Hopefully at some point, not too far in the future, there will be a more straightforward and basic way to do this. Let's see. Do you have any other examples of how and where to record metadata? That's actually a very good question. It's a little bit of a technical question, but we didn't really go into some of the specific ways of being able to do that during the webinar. Safe to say that for different types of digital items, there are different ways of recording metadata, and you can find some of that information on our website, on digitalpreservation.gov. Let's see, another question. All right, here's a good one. Is it crazy to print copies of digital documents and store them in archival quality clear sleeve boxes as a low-tech backup solution? No, it's not. This is a good solution, actually, if you are dealing with a limited number of items. If you have a few really important photographs, for example, or other items, it's a great idea to print them out. As I mentioned, hard copy materials, we have a lot of experience with them, and they've proven to be extremely durable. We can't say that so much for digital materials. The problem is if you start dealing with large quantities of digital materials, large quantities of digital content. It's hard to print out hundreds, thousands of individual documents and store them. You can do it, but it's a big job. The other issue is if you've got things like websites, you can print them out, but the paper version isn't really the same as a digital version. But in general, if you want to print out a few things, that's a great way. That's a great way to preserve them. Let's see. What are your views on CD-RW versus CD one-time use? That's a very good question. What it relates to is burnable media that you can use on your computer. You can get a disk drive that will allow you to make a copy on a CD-ROM, and you've got a choice. You can get a one-time version where you write on it once and that's it, or you can get another one that's erasable. You can write on it and then you can go back and erase it and write over it again. Generally speaking, the CD rewritables are less stable than the one-time use CDs. There's been some testing done that has demonstrated that the rewritables are not as stable, not as long-lasting. Although any type of CD material of any type is subject to loss or subject to problems over time. So in the long run, pretty much any kind of CD is problematic, although probably the rewritables are the worst of the bunch. Let's see. what are the major concerns regarding data degradation because of compression? Is there a best compression standard? That's another really good question. The basic issue here is that if you have a digital file and it's compressed, which is special technology that reduces the amount of information or can reduce the amount of information that's made up within the file to make it smaller, is that a problem? Well, it can be a problem. Generally speaking, for archival preservation, we don't recommend compression. That's because if there's any kind of an error in the file, if it's compressed, the error is made that much worse, simply because the information is squeezed together, and if something goes wrong with one little piece of the file, you tend to have problems with many more pieces of the file. The other problem with compression is that it's another sort of technical hurdle. You may have a file format that at some point in the future you've got to figure out how to deal with. Say, just to pick something randomly, it may be a JPEG, which is a video or a picture format, graphic format. If there's some sort of special compression technology on top of that or buried within that, that's something else that you have to worry about dealing with at some point in the future. So generally speaking, the preferred way to be able to archive digital content is either without compression, or don't want to get too technical, but there are things called lossless compression, which can be okay. On the other hand, you also have to sort of just bear practicality in mind. If you're a home user and you have a digital camera, you may be creating digital photographs that use JPEG with some sort of compression in it. And if that's what you have, that's what you have. So you just kind of have to do the best you can with it. But generally speaking, if you have a choice, it's best to avoid compression. Let's see. Let's see. Are gold DVDs really better than ordinary? I would say no. Well, let me back up a little bit. They might be a little bit better. The problem with any, as I mentioned before, that any kind of recordable media is that they're eventually going to break down. They're made up of different layers. There's a layer of plastic that's sort of the basic disk. Then there's a data layer, and then there's another layer on top of that. And these are subject to variations in manufacture. They're subject to variations in how well they age. So it's pretty much been demonstrated that any type of CD or DVD eventually is going to degrade. The idea with the gold is that it's more stable and it will last longer. It might last longer than a typical CD, but it's still I still would not regard it as a archival or a permanent way to store anything. Here's a good question. Do you know of any good tools for photo tagging that keep the tags in the file so they are readable across multiple computers? We have, we actually, within NDIP, our program here, have worked with some partners who have kind of looked into this. And there is a website called DP Best Flow, all one word, that goes into quite a bit of detail about how you can add metadata and keep it within the folder or keep it within the image and allow them to be transferred among and allow the metadata to stay with that photo. as it moves across different computers and different copies, or different copy sets. And that's really ideal. That's really what you want to be able to do, because when you make a copy of your photo, you want all the metadata to travel with it, so that you've got complete information in your original set of copies, as well as complete information on whatever other copies that you make of the photos. So that's DP Best Flow. Check them out. What's the best way to preserve many emails? That's a really good question also. These are all really good questions. Email can be a very tricky type of digital format to deal with. And that's part of the reason for that is that there are different ways of creating and managing emails. You can have what's known as a desktop client on your machine. That would be something like Microsoft Outlook or GroupWise. And what that does is it essentially keeps all that information on your, if you're running it from home as a standalone, it keeps all the emails on your machine. And what you're going to need is some sort of tool or process to be able to export those emails into some sort of standalone file. And that's different for each type of email client that you've got. If you use something like Gmail or Hotmail or one of these so-called cloud internet email providers, what happens is that all copies of your email are out there in the cloud, and what you've got to be able to do is figure out a way to download all your emails and store them locally. And there are different ways of doing that. I know that some of those providers are trying to think about ways to do that. There have been periodic outages of some of these services that get people very upset and concerned about losing all their email. So there are different ways of doing it for some of the different providers. It's variable in terms of how hard it is. It's gotten easier. It still is not something that a non-expert can do easily, but it is getting better simply because people are starting to realize, hey, I don't want to leave all my email out in the cloud. What happens if it goes away? I want to be able to have a copy that I can access. Does Flickr or other cloud storage allow TIFFs or just JPEGs? As far as Flickr is concerned, I don't think they use TIFFs. I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think they pretty much rely on JPEG. If you're using some sort of cloud storage provider to store files, it doesn't matter. They'll take whatever you have. But if you're relying on Flickr, I think you're tied to a JPEG file format. What scanning resolution do you recommend for archiving photos? That is a fairly technical question that I am not going to attempt to answer. There is some good guidance on our website and on other library websites that talks about some of the standards and some of the approaches the library is using. And I do know that there are different, they recommend some different resolutions depending on what type of photo it is, whether it's color or black and white, things like that. So I will refer you to digitalpreservation.gov for that question. What duplication format do you prefer? CD, DVD, or hard drive? this may have anticipated what I talked about in the presentation. It's 6 of one, half a dozen of another. Each one has advantages and disadvantages. Neither one is a silver bullet. Neither one, I would not feel comfortable depending on just one of them alone. If I had multiple copies, I would actually prefer to use both, or I prefer to use different types of storage devices, simply because each one of them is a little unpredictable in terms of how long they might last. And if you've got multiple kinds, then you've got some insurance. Let's see. How can we get metadata from donors? Well, this must be from a librarian or an archivist. Think about your own experience in terms of entering metadata for your own files. It's not always, well, some people maybe like doing it, some people enjoy doing it, but it's generally not the first thing that people think about doing. But on the other hand, if you've gone back and tried to find something, or you're benefiting from metadata that somebody else has provided, that's a pretty good object lesson. So it might be useful to try to tell people who are providing you digital items just how important metadata is. It's maybe not maybe they'll see it as something where they don't have to jump through a hoop. It's really something that really can mean something. Okay, one more question here. Let's see. Should I save all my images as TIFFs so they don't have the loss factor that JPEGs do? Well, if you do this gets back in some ways to that question about compression. The good thing about TIFFs is that you can create them without compression, and which means you get a really big file. But on the other hand, you don't have to worry about some of the problems or some of the potential problems associated with compression. So generally speaking, if you've got the option to save images or create images as TIFFs, and you're willing to deal with larger file sizes and that sort of thing, it's a good idea. They're probably more robust and will be more sustainable into the future. So that's it. Thank you all very much. I appreciate your attention to this. I appreciate all the really good questions. Sorry we didn't get to them, each and every one of them. But we appreciate it. And again, check our website, digitalpreservation.gov. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill, for a very informative presentation. I hope our participants will be able to use some of the practical tips you gave to better preserve their own digital memories. Thank you also to our audience. We hope you found today's session useful. You will soon receive a short evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to fill it out and return it to us. Your comments help the LEX Continuing Education Committee evaluate and plan future continuing education offerings. If you're interested in viewing parts of the presentation again or sharing it with others, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording shortly after the webinar. The presentation will also be archived and freely available at the ALCTS Webinar website. If you're interested in learning more about preservation, please visit ALA's Preservation Week website, where you can find more tips and resources about preserving your personal collections. Thank you to our sponsors for today's webinars, the HF Group, and thanks as well to Carrie Cassio, a member of the LEX Continuing Education Committee, for her technical assistance. Thank you all again for joining us today. Goodbye.